tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hey folks, this is David McKnight. Welcome to the Power of Zero show. Thanks for coming back for another consecutive week. I'm the best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LERP, The Volatility Shield, and as you by now, Tax-Free Income for Life, which will be appearing in a bookstore near you through Penguin Random House on November 17th. That launch date should not stop you, however, from heading over to Amazon or any other online bookstore for that matter and ordering a pre-order copy. And if you go to davidmcknight.com, you can actually take that receipt, type the number into the field at where it says claim my free chapter, and actually download chapter 1 right away. You won't have to wait until November 17th to get chapter 1. That'll give you a little taste of what's to come. If you are looking for someone to help you navigate all the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, head over to davidmcknight.com. We're happy to hook you up with someone who is trained, vetted, and qualified and who is in your area. And if you are an advisor who is looking to transition your practice to a Power of Zero practice, head over to powerofzero.com and we're happy to discuss it with you. Today's episode is based on an article written by Maya MacGuineas. Now, if you're saying, hey, Maya MacGuineas, that name sounds familiar, it should sound familiar if you've watched our movie, The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming. Maya MacGuineas is president of the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. She was very gracious to appear for an interview in our movie, and I think she made a wonderful contribution. Now, the title of this article, it's actually found in the Washington Post. The debt is huge because Trump kept his promises. The title of this podcast episode is the Post-Mortem on Trump's first term. Now, Post-Mortem is an analysis of something after the fact. So we're assessing how things went, at least from a fiscal perspective, in Trump's first term. Now, much of what Maya says is that we should not be surprised by what happened during Trump's first term, because this is what he campaigned on. Now, before I go any further, I have to once again reprise this notion that I am not here to make a political statement. This is neither a statement on the left or the right. This is a statement of mathematical reality. My goal is just not to praise or condemn any proposals or what have you, just to tell you the financial and mathematical consequences of them. So with that framework, let's proceed forward. So essentially and by the way, I will include a link to this article in the show notes, but essentially the thesis of her article is that we should not be terribly surprised by the debt that has been accumulated over the course of the last 4 years, because it is merely a fulfillment of Trump's 2016 campaign promises, and that our fiscal health is very much the worse for it. Now, the goal of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, among other things, is to estimate the budgetary impact of all of the major candidates' proposals. And in 2016, when Trump ran on a platform of basically steep tax cuts, increased spending on both defense and veterans, and more importantly, and this is something that she hits on over and over again, and I think something that I've hit on over and over again, no major changes to Social Security and MediCare. If you recall from his campaigning prior to the last election, it was, I will not touch your Social Security and I will not touch your Medicare. And we are now paying the price for it. We will get into some of those numbers shortly. And she says the numbers proposed were so huge that frankly, they seemed exaggerated and improbable. In other words, she said, the amount of debt that he was looking to accumulate over the course of the first term was just astronomical, so as to not even be believed. So that year, when the debt was already on an unsustainable path and growing faster than the economy, the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated that Trump's agenda would increase deficits, and deficits, remember the difference between deficit and national debt. An annual deficit is simply how much money the government is spending above and beyond what it brings in. And that is the amount that gets added to the national debt. So if she says a deficit over the subsequent decade is 4.6 trillion, that means that 4.6 trillion would be added to the national debt over the course of 10 years because of Trump's proposed agenda. She then goes on to say that the numbers at the end of the first term are even worse than projected. She says that because of all that borrowing, in addition to what we have now had to borrow, we've had to pile on top of that due to COVID-19. She says the debt numbers are alarming. The debt numbers are alarming. She says the debt was already on an unsustainable course, but now after Trump's first term, she says the debt numbers are alarming. And keep in mind, had a Democrat been in office, I would have brought you the exact same information. So I don't want to sugarcoat any of this. All right. In Trump's first 3 years before the coronavirus pandemic, he approved $3.9 trillion in borrowing, and that was just to pay for the tax cuts. The tax cuts really cost about $1.5 trillion over 8 years. So it was $1.5 trillion of new spending to be able to realize those tax cuts in the short term, and as well as additional spending. David Walker, when we interviewed him, he says, look, we ate the dessert before we ate the spinach. In other words, he says, we gave ourselves the tax cuts before making the hard decisions on what things we were going to cut. I think that any good economist will agree that tax cuts are okay so long as they're accompanied by a commensurate amount of spending cuts. So the problem is we didn't do that. We gave ourselves the dessert, but we did not eat the spinach. She says this substantially expanded the national debt during a period of strong, sustained economic growth. She says in our movie, she says, while everybody, all the other economies in the world, all the other governments of the world are paying down their debt because of the strong economy, she says, we are not getting our fiscal house in order. We are just piling debt upon debt. And she says the deficit has never been so high when coupled with an economy that was going as well as it was on the lead up to 2019 and ultimately 2020 prior to COVID. All right, let's talk about the impact of COVID relief. Okay. When you add up all of the additional deficit that came about because of spending and tax cuts, and you throw on top of that what we had to borrow for COVID-19. By the way, I'm convinced that the borrowing is not done. I think that there still may be some more borrowing by the end of the year to shore up that hole in the U.S. economy. Remember, the $2 trillion, according to most of the experts, that we borrowed initially was only enough to build a bridge halfway across the abyss in our economy. It was always understood that there would need to be another $2 trillion to build the other half of that bridge to see us to the other side. I don't think that anybody is criticizing the move to keep our economy afloat. Similar to 2018 when we had to resuscitate the economy with all sorts of bailouts. I don't think anybody's criticizing this. I think what they're saying is, had we been more fiscally responsible prior to COVID-19, we would not be in the same bind. We would be in a better position to be able to handle something like COVID-19 had we not accumulated so much debt prior to it. She says that there are a couple of things that the president largely followed through on his campaign proposals, but there are a couple of things that were different. Okay. She says, most significantly, he signed into law about $2.3 trillion of individual business and corporate tax cuts. She says that that's a big number, but as a result of those business tax cuts not being as steep as he had initially proposed, the cost of the tax cuts was only about half of the $4.5 trillion that he had projected in his campaign's tax plan. By the way, he does not have a tax plan for his second term. I think I spoke last week or the week before about how he has made off-the-cuff remarks, and we've had to read into those in terms of what his plans for his second term would be vis-a-vis tax cuts and tax reform, but he has not formalized that in any sort of a proposal. Okay, so she says $2.3 trillion of individual business and corporate tax cuts. That number was not as big as they thought it would be because he didn't reduce business taxes quite to the extent that he thought. During the campaign and leading up to the tax law's passage, there was much hand-waving about how the tax cuts would pay for themselves. Now, we've said it in the movie. We've said it subsequently. The tax cuts have not paid for themselves. Okay. We have accumulated debt on debt as a result of the tax cuts not paying for themselves. Now, Ronald Reagan was a trickle-down economics guy, which basically says if you increase tax cuts, lower taxes, increase capital going to corporations, that they will produce enough revenue to expand the economy. But remember, it's always got to be accompanied by a commensurate cut in spending. That is not what happened here. As far as defense goes, Trump more or less delivered on his promise to increase defense and veteran spending by about $950 billion. He signed into law two massive increases for the defense budget, along with new funding for veterans. Let's talk about discretionary spending. By the way, what is discretionary spending? Discretionary spending is not a very large part of the budget. Discretionary spending is the things that government actually has control over. What is not discretionary spending? The cost of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the national debt. This is all discretionary spending. We have to spend it. In order to not spend it, we would have to change the law. So discretionary spending, I think, is about 23% of the economy. Is like the one thing that we have control over. However, the Trump campaign had a plan to reduce discretionary spending by $750 billion over 10 years, which, gosh, that's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not a lot. But what did he do instead? He increased that part of the budget, discretionary spending, between 2017 and 2021 at a 10-year cost of $700 billion. So in other words, that's a delta of about $1.5 trillion. He proposed $750 billion of cuts, but he actually increased it by $700 billion. And really, she sums up by saying every major area of the government has grown significantly under the Trump administration. Finally, let's talk about Social Security and Medicare. Part of what she says was so unfortunate about the agenda that he ran on in 2016 was that he simply said that he would not touch Social Security and Medicare. You got to remember that every year that goes by where we don't in some way try to reform Social Security and Medicare has an economic cost, whether it comes in cuts to these programs down the road or massive tax increases. Every year that goes by where you fail to address these two programs means the fix on the back end is going to become even larger, even more draconian. She says an unfortunate commitment because Trump has largely kept his promise not to touch Social Security and Medicare. An unfortunate commitment because both programs face huge funding shortfalls and critical solvency challenges. She says, according to CBO, Congressional Budget Office, Medicare's hospital insurance trust fund is projected to run out of reserves by 2024, and that Social Security is projected to be insolvent by 2031, when the youngest of today's retirees turn 73. Ignoring these programs is not the same as protecting them. It dooms beneficiaries to large, abrupt, across-the-board benefit cuts, or, as I have long warned, across-the-board tax increases. I think that when you come right down to it, if you have a large swath of Americans who are reliant on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, it's going to be very difficult for a politician to cut those programs. I see instead massive tax increases that will be footed by you and me. All right. What is the future of debt? What is the debt trajectory as a result of Trump's first term? It says our debt is headed towards a new record in just a couple of years and is projected to grow faster than the economy indefinitely. All major trust funds are headed towards insolvency. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, disability, all of it is insolvent. We haven't done anything to fix it or to reform it. We are slated, get this is an important number. We are slated to spend $3.7 trillion on interest alone over the next decade. That's the cost of renting the money that we've already spent. And as I've long warned, what we are going to be required to pay on that debt, okay, is going to consume the federal budget eventually if we don't get our act in gear, okay, if we don't start to make radical and fundamental reforms to the federal budget. And she concludes by saying, yes, we need to borrow to address the current crisis, but we didn't have to enter this crisis with trillion-dollar deficits. In other words, all of the COVID spending, which would have been much more palatable had we actually come into this crisis with a fiscal house that was in order, and we weren't dealing with large annual deficits. So she says, whoever assumes office in January will need to put in place a credible long-term plan to reduce the debt once the economy is strong enough and save Social Security and Medicare. Of course, the other side of the aisle is not really any more fiscally responsible than what has happened on the right side of the aisle over the last 4 years. There's blame to spread all around. And as you've seen, there's all sorts of proposals, kind of a Biden camp that would likely build and increase debt even more. The scary part is we're starting to hear more and more about modern monetary theory, which posits that there is simply an infinity bucket, a bucket that is really monetization. They're just going to print their way out of it and print money to solve all these problems. The idea being that if you can simply, for example, print enough money to guarantee that everybody will receive $15 of hourly wage, a living wage as it were, that is going to spur on enough economic growth that wouldn't precipitate massive inflation. The problem is, to solve all of the problems facing our nation between interest on the national debt, unfunded obligations for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, you'd have to print $239 trillion, put it in a savings account, and hope that it earns Treasury rates to be able to deliver on everything that we are required to pay by law. What's the long and the short of it, folks? Take advantage of tax rates while they're historically low, because they are not likely to stay at these historically low levels for long. Take advantage of the next 6 years of historically low tax rates and put yourself in a position where you are insulated from the impact of rising taxes. You can do that by way of contributing to IRAs, Roth 401ks, executing Roth conversions, taking advantage of LIRPs, getting balances in your tax-deferred bucket low enough that your standard deduction offsets your RMDs, and of course, keep your provisional income low enough that your Social Security is also tax-free. That's the show for today, folks. I hope I'm not putting you in too bad a mood. Remember, my job is to give you strategy, but also to keep our eyes wide open as we march into a future where there's going to be a lot of fiscal challenges facing our country, and talk to you about how you can face those challenges head on. If you want to follow me on Twitter, please do. It's at McKnight & Co. And of course, I would love a review of any of my books, as well as our movie online. That is always appreciated and very much helps. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. We will talk to you same time next week.